Hi, everyone. Welcome to our final session in this workshop on social, behavioral, economic, and governance aspects of this pandemic. And this session is on behavioral modeling. If you have questions for the panelists, you can either post them on the live YouTube chat or tag us on Twitter at NSF_prepare. To learn more about Prepare, you can listen to our new podcast, Science Before the Storm, or visit our website at prepare-vo.org. And now I'll turn it over to Pete Piroli, who will moderate the session.
Hey, thank you, Anil. We have 4 great panelists today to talk about various aspects of behavior modeling with respect to COVID-19. First up is Christian Lebiere, who I've known for many, many years. Christian is a research faculty in the psychology department at Carnegie Mellon University. He's for years been working on cognitive architectures and various applications in psychology and AI and economics and decision theory and human-computer interaction. And he'll be talking about some work with respect to behavior modeling in COVID-19. Over to you, Christian.
Thank you, Pete. Share my screen. Should be in presentation mode. So the title of my talk is Cognitive Modeling of the Behavioral Effectiveness of Non-Pharmaceutical Interventions. It's the product of a fairly large team effort, including a number of network scientists, cognitive scientists, and computer scientists, including Kathleen Carley at CMU, Pete Piroli himself from the Institute for Human Machine Cognitions, and Orr from the University of Virginia Biocomplexity Institute. The main purpose of our research is to model the entire flow from information to behavior. People don't behave in a vacuum. They behave in response to the streams of information they get from mass media, social media, personal experiences, and in turn, they exhibit behavior that impacts the physical world, including the spread of epidemics. So we want to build that system on theories of individuals' health psychology, as well as predictive computational cognitive models of behavior. So the form that our effort will take are what we call psychologically valid agents that can be integrated into epidemiological models to predict the dynamics of behavior change in response to information about the epidemics, and in turn, its effect on the epidemic, and especially, as I mentioned, so the various forms of formal and informal messages. The principal tool that we'll be using is something called a cognitive architecture, which is a computational implementation of unified theories of cognition. You see a representation on the right there. The various sort of colorful boxes are meant to represent brain areas that are involved in perceptual, motor, and cognitive actions. And the whole system is meant to represent human cognition with all its capabilities and limitations, its ability to learn, be adaptive, individual differences, cognitive biases, all the aspects as much as possible that characterize human cognition. The cognitive architecture only provides, however, the basic mechanism, and there still needs to be a model that is supplied that represents how people go about making the decisions, taking in the information, and behaving in various settings. The particular framework that we adopt here is called instance-based learning, and that's a framework we've applied myself and a number of colleagues using the ACT-R cognitive architecture, that we've applied to make a decision in a wide range of situations, from behavioral economics to game theory to decision-making. And the basic idea is that we don't behave according to grand strategies that have to be defined or somehow optimized. Rather, we behave based on our experiences, and what the cognitive architecture that we just saw gives us is the ability to quickly and informally generalize from our experience to the new situation. So you see a graphical representation there on the right. The typical representation of situations and experiences in terms of what we call chunks of information, which are essentially an association of a context, which can be a set of features. So in this case, features would be reward, penalty, and probability, but they can be anything that represents a situation, a number of actions that can be taken, and then some kind of outcome that can be interpreted as having a utility in some way. So basically, the general decision-making pattern is given a situation and a set of possible actions, generate a series of expected outcomes for those actions and select the best one. That's actually quite simple. The interesting part is what you see there on the top right, which are the equations that essentially characterize the processes in the cognitive architecture. That capture various patterns like sensitivity to recency and frequency of information that reflects pervasive regularities of the human environment in the form of power laws, as well as the ability to generalize to similar situations from a semantic point of view. And again, those decisions have the characteristics of human cognition, which include biases that reflects experience, various cognitive biases. So for example, you may have heard of recency bias or confirmation bias. And that also reflect the diversity and size of the instance base of experiences, wherever they come from, whether as personal experiences or resulting from messaging. So in addition to frame our general approach to this particular problem of modeling behavior with respect to non-pharmaceutical intervention in epidemic, we rely on a theory called the theory of planned behavior that explains health behaviors and intentions in terms of three constructs. One is social norms that reflect normative beliefs generally received from society toward the desired behavior. Attitudes that reflect the intentions toward the execution of behavior, as well as control belief, which reflect the perception of the ability of controlling the behavior in a desired fashion. So that's the theoretical framework that we'll apply, and we'll see that we can essentially take each component of that framework and implement a piece of a cognitive model that focuses on that particular behavior, and then we can put them all together. So that's going to be the general structure of the presentation here. So the first part here reflects social norms. Those are the messages that we receive from the environment. So for example, you see a physical one there in terms of a sign on the Carnegie Mellon campus stating that face coverings are mandatory. You have a lot of other forms of social norms as well, from mass media, from social media, from interactions with friends and colleagues. So those norms, by and large, reflect the local context of decision. And they are encoded straightforwardly in the cognitive architecture in terms of chunks encoding competing actions, because fundamentally, those norms express the desirability of a behavior. So effectively, what we have there is competing pieces of information, essentially saying wear a mask or don't wear a mask, which is our initial non-pharmaceutical intervention that we are focusing on. We'll also model social distancing later on. So what we have here are effectively a competition between the activation of those competing social norms. Where do the activation of those social norms as reflected in the cognitive model come from? Well, a lot come from social media, which a number of people consume. So this data, for example, is data analyzed by Kathleen Carley on our team that reflects the prevalence of social media messages, Twitter specifically, related to mask wearing at various points from February to November in two states, California on the left and Pennsylvania on the right. And the messages were characterized as being, according to their hashtags, as being pro, con, neutral to mask wearing, or having mixed pros and cons. So we'll focus here on the pro versus con and ignore the mixed and neutral. So what this gives you is essentially a time series of frequency of pro versus con messages that people consuming that social media represented. So what we can do with that is effectively translate that into activation in the cognitive model according to those equations that I showed on the instance-based learning slide. And then the instance-based learning decision process will take place and will generate a probability of mask wearing, reflecting the state in memory that reflects in turn that those environmental frequency that accumulate over time and then decay over time according to power laws. We estimated a single parameter which reflects the blending mechanism, which is one of the equations that I showed on that slide, which essentially you can imagine it so pushing toward a winner-take-all process of more extreme and uniform mask wearing as opposed to a regression to the mean. So it's the only parameter that we estimate here. All the rest come directly from the input from the social media environment through the mechanism of the cognitive architecture in the model. And you can see here validation against the COVID states data set for 4 states, 4 large states, California, Pennsylvania, New York, and Florida. And the periods of the data for which we have the Twitter data versus the data for which we have the actual mask wearing data are mostly overlapping, not quite identical, but you can see that in general, there is a very good overlap, although there is some variation that reflects a number of factors. So what we did here to validate the model is aggregate over the 4 states. So now we just have a single parameter that we estimated, a fairly neutral value that is usually very close to the value that we assume in cognitive models of a lot of other tasks. And you can see that you get a very good fit to the data. So essentially we can predict probability of mask wearing as a function of social media messaging in that particular environment. So that's the first slice of the model. The second slice of the model is the control part, the ability of people to control the environment, control their actions in order to try and achieve a desired effect. So here we look at a pattern that was very pervasive, has been very pervasive in all levels, all situations, all localities throughout this epidemic. Which is in terms of RT, which is the infection rate. And you can sort of understand it in terms of its neutral value. If the neutral value of 1, an infected person in general transmits to a single person. Larger values than 1 reflect in more than 1 person being infected for every sick person, which leads to ultimately to an exponential increase in the number of infectious people. And vice versa, a value less than 1 leads to a gradual exponential decrease in the number of cases. And the pattern that you see there, and that's the early period of the epidemic, but it's continued, is at the very start, the RT value was quite high, somewhere between 2 and 3, sometimes even higher in some places. And you see a very precipitous decline, and then a gradual oscillation around that key value of 1. The red values include indicator value greater than 1. The green lines indicate a value at less than 1. So there is clearly something there in the control, in the system, that allows it to be controlled toward that's essentially that value that stabilizes the number of infections. And the way we instantiate that is in terms of new knowledge structures that effectively encode what we call contextual reaction. And we label them fear and hope to express their semantics, which is essentially when the rate of infections goes up, again, as translated in media, as perceived by people, that leads to trigger an activation of the fearful reactions that lead to the trigger of various social distancing or mask wearing actions that are intended to lower the rate, and vice versa. When the value of RT falls below 1 and then the infection starts to recede, then people become more hopeful and might relax their behavior. So just so we saw previously those competing norms, wear versus don't wear competing, now we have those competing reactions that we label fear versus hope, but that are now contextual to the state of the epidemic, again, as perceived over time by people. And you can see there that we very much reproduce those kind of damped oscillation, the very quick decrease followed by fluctuation. What you see here is 3 different curves that correspond to 3 different sort of norm biases, i.e. a more pro-wearing mask, an anti-wearing mask, and a neutral wearing mask that correspond to different populations where the prevalence of mask wearing pros versus con messaging might bias the people in opposite direction. And you can see that that does not affect that very quick decrease at the start, which again is the second component that's triggered by those contextual reaction, but rather it impacts the overall level over time. You can look at this in terms of a dynamical system, and in particular in terms of a phase space, where you plot over time on the x-axis, the infection rate, and again, this value of 1 is the neutral value, against the probability of mask wearing. And what our model gives you is a delayed control mechanism that you can see here to walk through the phases. It starts with a fairly high infection rate, which, as we saw, triggers fairly high compliance rate, which is going to push the infection rate down. Now, the infection rate is below 1, so that's going to lead to a relaxation of mask wearing, which in turn going to lead to a further increase back of the infection rate, which is going to lead to an increase in mask wearing again. And you can see that cycle of damped oscillation where the magnitude gradually decays as you go through these cycles. And that's a stable system that will ultimately stabilize. Is again, although what we've seen throughout the epidemics is that there are a number of external shocks that happen. Governments institute mandates, the weather changes, either gets warmer or colder, which pushes people indoor or outdoors, or as we'll see, various strains can occur that have a higher level of infectiousness and again, destabilize the system that in turn, again, needs that stabilization mechanism to activate. So the third level of mechanism, of that mechanism are the behavioral attitudes. And here we'll look at that from the point of view of polarization. The data that you see on the top right is data from a study by Goldwitzer that looked at county level data between blue versus red, i.e. Clinton leaning versus Trump leaning as per categorization of the 2016 election. And the measure here is social distancing, reduction in general movement. So 0 correspond to movement sort of before the start of the epidemic and mandates in the US. So the left is early March and the right is late May when the lockdowns were gradually ending. And what you can see here is expected an increase in a decrease in mobility that gradually wears off as the mandates are lifted. But you can see a divergence between blue versus right counties that surprisingly enough increases over time. So to model that, we modeled that as a decision-making task, which is essentially a choice between a safe option and a risky option. The safe option, which is effectively mask wearing, corresponds to a fairly certain outcome of avoiding infections, whereas the risky options has 2 different outcomes. The most likely one is to avoid infections and perhaps the inconvenience of wearing a mask, and is therefore slightly more desirable. The other option, which is low probability but potentially catastrophic, is associated with not wearing masks, is to get sick. So it turns out that we had modeled before, in the context of a choice prediction computation, a number of situations varying those parameters. That is, what is the probability spread for the risky option? And what are the differences in the expected payoffs? So we could take that model effectively off the shelf and model people reaction. And we saw that you get the very same spread in curves there as a function of, here the different curves refer to different prevalence of the messaging. So essentially, you can view that as the probability or the frequency of pro-mass messaging. And you can see that the curves associated with higher pro-mass messaging both have a higher reduction, but also a more sustained reduction than the curves corresponding to a lower frequency messaging. And again, this is all standard parameter. This is essentially our existing model validated against laboratory data applied off the shelf to this particular problem. Now, I've shown the 3 levels of our model, so it's time to start putting them together. The particular data that we're modeling for this is the recent data about what seems to be the final phase of the epidemic. It also, again, happened at every level. So I have the 3 different data sets here that are represented on the right, are for Pennsylvania, Allegheny County, which is the urban county where Pittsburgh is located, and Westmoreland County, which is a more rural county to the east of Allegheny County. And you can see very much the same pattern of a stable period, as we saw, which seems to be the hallmark of much of the epidemic, followed by a certain increase in late March, then a stabilization for a while, and then a gradual decrease. And that was seen in all measures, cases, hospitalization, death, with the proper lag in national, state, and local level. So the way we modeled this with 4 different mechanisms, 2 external mechanisms, so pharmaceutical or biological, and 2 cognitive behavioral mechanisms that we've been modeling. So the first mechanism in that time period was the gradual introduction of vaccines that reduces the RT rate in proportion to the vaccination rate. The second one was the gradual dominance of what was called the British variant, what is now called the Alpha variant, which is more infectious by the factor of 0.4 that gradually took over in that time period. Now, the 2 cognitive mechanisms that act in concert with that. So the first one is a relaxation of behavior that was triggered by the introduction of vaccines and the seasonal relaxation that typically seems to happen in the spring. And we reflected that in the different activations at that first level of the model, the social norms, the wear versus don't wear norms. And then the gradual tightening of behavior that occurs later as after the increases take effect, which is reflected in that sort of reaction, the hope versus fear aspect of the model, the second level of the model that I mentioned. And you can see here that we do a fairly good job at modeling this curve. So again, here you have the stable part of the curve, then the gradual increase that reflects the explosion in particular of the British variant and the relaxation of behavior. Then the behavioral tightening and the increasing vaccination stabilizes it and then gradually drive it down toward the continuous decrease that we're still observing now. We have a number of future work that we're currently in the process of doing. One is to continue integrating those various levels. Another one is to continue the work of natural language processing, of taking those messages and mapping them to a finer grain onto the semantics of the various messaging and in turn onto the various levels of our cognitive model. extend the model to account for vaccination decisions, which we can incorporate in this framework, so in very much the same way as we've done before. And then finally, integrate our behavior model into of a large-scale agent-based model and express it in the typical form that the epidemiological model takes, which are ordinary differential equation. That essentially capture the math of the cognitive mechanism that we've described in a way that's directly integratable at the same level as the traditional epidemiological simulations without requiring an agent-based model to be used. I could stop here, or I could very quickly go through another result or two. Pete, what would you like me to do?
Aaron, I think we have, is it 25 minutes
Yep.
is the hard stop?
Yep.
Yes, that would probably be good.
Okay, good. Although I would love to see those slides, but thank you, Christian. And I want to remind everyone that if you have questions for Christian or for any of the other panelists, you can just put those questions in the live chat, or you can tweet them by tagging at @NSF_prepare. And we will be accumulating all those questions for all the panelists. And at the very end of the session, we'll go through them one by one. Okay, so next up is Dan Romer. He's a psychologist and a research director at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He conducts policy that's relevant to social individual differences and especially young people's health and development. Today, he's going to be talking about conspiracies and COVID-19. And over to you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay. So ever since the beginning of the pandemic, the Annenberg Public Policy Center, which is directed by Kathleen Hall Jameson, and I have been studying using surveys how people responded to the pandemic, the kind of information they were getting, and what kinds of influences were affecting their response. And my computer is not, uh-oh. I don't know what's going on. Oh, okay. Figured another way to do it. So what I'm going to talk about is the nature and characteristics of conspiracy beliefs, how we studied them, what are some of the characteristics of the believers of these beliefs, the media outlets that attract and support them, and the challenges they pose for confronting the pandemic. So as you probably know, conspiracy beliefs are explanations for major events that hold unknown actors with great power and malevolent intent as responsible for those events. And some common examples are the JFK assassination, the 9/11 attacks, and one more relevant and recent is the measles vaccine is harmful to children, and the pharmaceutical industry and the government are hiding that. And what you see in all of these is there are powerful actors. We know something about them, but we don't know who they are because they act in secret. Now, we studied 3 of them throughout the year 2020 that are related to the pandemic, that the virus was created by the Chinese government, that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention were exaggerating the pandemic to hurt Trump, and that the pharmaceutical industry was secretly behind the virus because they wanted to sell drugs. So what we did is I'm going to tell you about a panel that we created using the National Opinion Research Corporation America Speaks panel. We surveyed these same people at 3 points in time: March 2020, July 2020, and November 2020. And we had over 800 folks that we could study at each time point. And so we have a nice way of tracking the same people over time, and they are nationally representative to a large degree. We did this online, so we're missing people who don't use online methods for interacting with the world, but basically we're covering everybody. And so what you see here is at the 3 time points, what is the level of acceptance of these 3 beliefs? And what I show you here is the proportion of the sample that rated these 3 beliefs as either definitely or probably true. And what you see is the pharmaceutical belief doesn't change very much. It's lower, but the other 2 are much higher, and they rise quite a bit, as you can see, from March to July, and then they level off in November. The other thing about them is they're highly interrelated. So if a person says one of these is true, they're likely to say the other is true, which you can see in that alpha. They're also related to acceptance of vaccination. This was in March. You can see if you bin these, the composite into 4 groups from low to high, that the high group is much more likely to say they're not at all or not too likely to get the vaccine. Of course, this is at a point in time when there was no vaccine, but we asked them, would you take one? And over half of the people in this upper group are saying, no way. So these are important beliefs. There are really 2 segments of the population I want to talk about and tell you about. One are the non-white folks in the US, which are the Hispanic and Black, are the 2 largest groups we looked at. Both of them were more likely to accept these conspiracies. This is just an example of the pharmaceutical industry. You see that people who identify as Hispanic were more likely to say that it was either probably or definitely true. Same for Black respondents. They were more likely to say than other people that that the pharmaceutical industry was behind the pandemic. And you see this as well in trust. And I know other people have talked about this in today and yesterday, that what underlies a lot of conspiratorial thinking is a lack of trust in this case, health authorities. And you see that those people who identify as Hispanic are much less likely to say they have a great deal of trust in Dr. Anthony Fauci. And the same is true for Black respondents. Again, reflecting this general lack of trust in health authorities. Now, one of the things we did right away in March was we asked people, well, what are you doing? And when we did this is right at the point when all the lockdowns were happening. And people were really complying to a great degree. They were washing their hands and doing all kinds of stuff. They weren't wearing face masks because the government wasn't telling them to do it. But if you take account of these, you see that almost 40% of the folks said they were doing all 7 of these outside of wearing a face mask. And even there, if you look at the composite again of the 4 conspiracies, at the 3 conspiracies, you see that the people who were believing in those were less likely to do even those very basic, simple things at the beginning of the pandemic. So these are beliefs that are consequential. Now, we also looked at other factors. So health belief models, which are similar to the model that was just discussed earlier, focus on things like the threat of a disease. So are you worried about getting infected? We also asked, is this a threat that's of major national consequence in comparison to other things like natural disasters? And then we also looked at fear of vaccines, which are very important to consider because if you're afraid of a vaccine in general, you're probably going to be concerned about taking a COVID vaccine. And if you look at the other major segment of the population, which was also somewhat suggested earlier, political conservatives, you see that for them, there was a very large both increase and acceptance of 2 out of the 3 of these conspiracies, much less so for the pharmaceutical one. But this is the other major group that we're going to focus on that was very much influenced to accept these conspiracies. And if you look at this, pattern and compare it to people who identify as liberals, the liberals, A, are not likely to believe them, and they show hardly any increase over that time period. And these are two this is, each of these groups are about 30% of the population in terms of our surveys. So this is a dramatic difference. So what we did in our first study, we looked at the first two waves because that's where most of the action was happening in terms of changes. And we used what's known as a structural equation model, which allows us to look at the relationship between these beliefs as predictors prospectively. If we assess things in March, like their political ideology, how much mainstream TV they watch, whether they're male or not, for example. If we look at these things and try to see, well, what predicts the two threats that we assessed and whether or not they were willing to take action in March. And then in July, we asked her specifically about mask wearing because that was regarded as one of the most important methods of protecting oneself. And what you see is that both of these threats were inversely related to conspiracy beliefs. This is the composite of the conspiracy. So if you believe these conspiracies, you didn't think there was much of a threat. And you also were much less likely, as I've shown before, to take action. In addition, we see that ideology, this is now liberal ideology, was inversely related to these, but was positively related to both of the threats and to taking action in March, which is mask wearing. So here we see the importance of that, of the ideology. And then we see the importance of a media source of information, namely mainstream TV. So people who are reliant on mainstream TV, which was a major source of information here in the pandemic at the beginning, they're more likely to see it as a threat, and they're more likely to wear masks. And people who were older were less likely to believe in these conspiracies and more likely to wear masks. And when we looked at vaccination, we see somewhat of the same patterns, except we have new things happening here. We have the belief in the harm of a vaccine, namely the MMR vaccine, which is highly related to conspiracy beliefs. So if one believes these conspiracies, one is also very likely to think that vaccines are harmful. This particular one is harmful. And I think we now know that this is a much more generalized belief. And I think Dolores is also going to be talking about this later. But in addition to that, we see a direct prediction. Again, this is what people are saying in March of how they will accept a vaccine in July, an inverse relationship. And we see similar things with TV. People who watch TV are more likely to accept the vaccine, older people more likely, and less likely to believe in conspiracies. So this raised some questions like, what influences either the persistence or change in these beliefs, right? The former model I showed you only looked at what happens at one point in time. How do they believe things in March? How does that influence what they do in July? And do uses of various media play a role in either the persistence or growth of conspiracy beliefs? And are some people more prone to conspiracy beliefs, to change in conspiracy belief than others? So we really focus very intensely on where people are getting information in general. So we asked them, where do you typically get information through the media? And we assessed 6 different sources: conservative media, which includes those sources you see there, mainstream broadcast TV, liberal sources, which includes, as you all know, MSNBC, what are called aggregators, that's Google News, Yahoo, social media, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and mainstream print, which are the big national, mostly newspapers, but Associated Press, which feeds information to them. And what you see is pretty much a flat pattern, except for the fact that mainstream TV is like enormous. This is in terms of heavy use, okay? This is not total use, just heavy use. And you see that conservative media is quite large relative to these other sources. Liberals a little lower. But people are getting a lot of information through mainstream TV. And if you look at conservative media, not surprisingly, given what I've shown you earlier with regard to conservative respondents, those who claim to be relying on conservative media are showing much larger changes. They're seeing some change in the pharmaceutical conspiracy, but really it's a lot of the action is in the deep state belief that the CDC is trying to undermine Trump, and the belief that the Chinese are somehow using the virus as a weapon. You don't see that very much with mainstream TV users. You see some increase in the Chinese weapon belief, and among social media users, some increase. I wouldn't say, dramatic, but some. And when you look at mainstream print, these now are the big national mainstream newspapers, which are also online. If anything, you see there's a decline over time, except for the bioweapon belief. And so this tells us that, the information you rely on has a big impact on how much you're going to accept these various conspiracies. So when we'd use another causal model here to try to understand what predicted changes in these conspiracy beliefs. And you see that over time, these three beliefs were pretty stable. You could predict them pretty well, knowing what they were in March to July. But there were factors that predicted whether or not there would be a change. And so people who are more educated declined in their belief, despite the fact that they were lower to begin with. People who use conservative media increased in their belief, despite the fact that they were already believing them. People using mainstream print declined in their belief of them. Social media, the relationship was relatively small. And again, ideology, where this is representing liberal ideology, predicted a decline. These three factors, I've already told you about whites being less likely to believe in them, and that's true here, older folks, and people watching mainstream TV. Now, these are influences that only carried over by virtue of their belief to begin with. They did not predict change. So as a result of these analyses, we developed what we're calling the echo chamber hypothesis. And what are echo chambers? Well, echo chambers are typically applied to media environments that attract like-minded members. And as a result of being attracted to those environments, they have their beliefs reinforced due to repeated exposure to messages that satisfy their interests. And those messages can be reliable or not. That's one of their interesting characteristics. And what we're arguing is that the conservative media environment in the United States has attracted people who are predisposed to believe in COVID conspiracies. And these were, not surprisingly, conspiracies that were either directly or indirectly supported by the president, which is why conservatives would be particularly likely to be attracted to them. But the other thing to remember is that if you're attracted to conspiracies, you're going to tend to distrust mainstream media, which is going to further result in an echo chamber of reliance on conservative news and commentary. And I think a quote from Frank Luntz, who's a very famous conservative Republican pollster and focus group leader, talked about Fox News, which is one of the biggest sources of conservative news and commentary, said users of Fox News want their news to affirm them rather than inform them. And that's pretty much what we think is what's going on. So what we did was we measured what one way of determining whether someone has a conspiratorial thinking tendency. And we use three items that have been used before by a political scientist named Robert Usinski. So these are the three items, and we think they capture pretty much what people who are conspiratorial thinkers will believe in. That if even though we live in a democracy, there's a few people running things, we don't know who they are, and they control our lives. And people tend to, who believe any one of these tend to believe the other, which you see in that high alpha. And this is the distribution of that composite. It's relatively normal. You do see a bump here at the end, at the low end. You know, there are more people who don't believe these things, but there's about 20% that are up here in this upper end who, you know, will agree with these ideas in the United States. So what did this predict? We predicted that persons who have these kinds of thinking patterns are going to be attracted to conservative media. They're going to be likely to reject mainstream media. And that's going to also be, these media are going to attract conservative media users because they're also attracted to that source of information, even if they're not conspiratorial thinkers. And that continued exposure to the content on conservative media will increase belief in them and reduce trust in government and adoption of preventive actions. Now, it's important to also keep in mind that a lot of people don't believe in echo chambers. So the reason being that mainstream media, as I showed you, is so widespread. Mainstream media is so powerful in not supporting conspiracies that it's inevitable people are going to be exposed to mainstream media, and they're not, and mainstream media is not going to support these kinds of ideas. So the echo chambers are going to be restricted to a small segment of the population. But remember, in which we kept in mind here, 20% of the population are heavy, or close to 20% are heavy users of these conservative media. And that can have important implications for controlling a public health crisis like a pandemic. So we used our 3 waves of data to test the hypothesis. We used growth curve modeling, which is another structural equation approach to identify changes over time, which you can look at both at the individual level, and you can look at whether people remain stable over time as well. And we could do this, we can look at conspiracy beliefs as a function of media use and other individual differences like conspiratorial thinking, conservative ideology, and other predictors. And we can also look at mediation between media use, conspiratorial thinking, and whether or not conspiracy beliefs play a role in how much people are wearing masks, intending to get vaccinated, and trust the CDC, which is, of course, a major arm of the government. So this is the basic model that we tested. And so we have an intercept for various predictors. We have 2 major intercepts that we identified, the mainstream print and conservative media intercepts, and mainstream print slopes. So we found that these 3 predictors in terms of the media were major players in either reducing conspiracy beliefs at the intercept, or in the case of conservative media, increasing conspiracy beliefs at the intercept, and also increasing conspiracy belief slopes. In other words, people who use a lot of conservative media at the intercept, the beginning of the pandemic, were more likely to show growth in their conspiracy beliefs. And then there are some people who actually increased their use of print, which led to a reduction in conspiracy belief slopes. Then you can look at how these are related to outcomes. So conspiracy belief intercepts were negatively related to trust in the CDC, and they were negatively related to the slope of trusts, to the slope, which is the change in how much people are trusting the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And of course, the conspiracy slopes conspiracy belief slopes were also inversely related to that. So that's our basic model. So what we can do then is we can look at, well, what kinds of things predict these various media? So conspiracy belief intercepts, of course, as I've shown you before, negatively related to age, but very positively related to conspiratorial thinking. The slopes in conspiracy beliefs were much more related, apart from media use, to conservative ideology. But here, now we look at the important predictions. Conservative media intercepts are both more likely to be related to being either conservative in ideology or having conspiratorial thinking. Whereas print news, which I showed you is important in reducing conspiratorial thinking and ultimately trust, was less likely to be used by either of these groups. And in particular, growth in print news was negatively related to people with conspiratorial thinking. And the same you see with TV news. Both of these groups are not likely to be using TV news. Now, let's look in particular at each of these media sources. So conservative media, if you divide them up into high, medium, and low users, the high users are about, in this case, 12%. I'm using a stringent criterion. You can see that they're predominantly composed of either conservative folks who are high conspiracy believers or conservative folks who are low conspiracy. Either way, they're conservative and they're very likely to be believers in conspiracies. And that belief as a component of the use of other media as you move away from heavy use goes down. If you look at mainstream print, whoops, I'm going backwards here. If you look at mainstream print, it's much more balanced. You have a much higher rate of liberals with low conspiracy belief at the high end. And then you also have conservatives, but again, low conspiracy believers. And then with broadcast TV, also much flatter. But again, the conservative high conspiracy folks are skewing away. They're not watching broadcast TV. And so we can also look at these outcomes: vaccination, mask wearing, and trust. And what you see across the board is that people who start out with believing conspiracies are negatively related to all of these. They don't believe in vaccination to begin with. They go down in their intention to use vaccine. They go down in their willingness to wear masks, and they go down in their trust for the CDC. This is apart from where they started. And one of the ironies of all this, which I don't have time to go into, is folks who believed in conspiracies at the beginning were also somewhat more likely to trust the CDC and the vaccine, partly because they trusted Trump. And mainstream TV folks, were also much more on board with all three of these health outcomes, but it didn't have any impact on change. There's no relationship between how much you watch TV and whether you grow, whether you become more accepting of vaccination, mask wearing, or trust in the centers. And then when you look at how much these media uses are related through conspiracy beliefs, you see that for print and as mediated by conspiracy beliefs, it's all positive, right? So because print reduces belief in conspiracies, you get a positive relationship across the board to either the intercepts or the slopes. When it comes to conservative media, where you get an increase in belief in conspiracies, you see a negative relationship across the board. Some evidence here of print actually having an unfavorable effect as well in terms of the slope of trust. So in conclusion, I'm trying to get done here. What we're concluding is that conservative media have supported the growth of conspiracy beliefs regarding the pandemic during 2020. Mainstream print media have worked to reduce those beliefs. Mainstream TV has neither reduced the beliefs or increased preventive action, net of these conspiratorial thinking tendencies. And despite faith in the reach of mainstream news as a buffer against echo chambers, their influence is limited because the people who use these media, the conservative media, either avoid mainstream media or are predisposed to discount the information they get from them. I think some other things we'd like to entertain are that much of the focus on misinformation during the pandemic has been directed towards social media. And I think a lot of what we heard in the workshop is directed towards social media because it's nice to understand how people interact with other people. But even if the major platforms have removed the content that is deemed harmful, which many of them did, it does not reduce the influence of echo chambers on either traditional media, cable broadcast and radio, or the internet in general. And so we think that the existence of conservative media as an echo chamber is continuing to pose challenges to confronting the pandemic and other crises, which I haven't looked at, and we haven't looked at in these surveys, other crises in governance, which I think we're all very much aware of. So again, Kathleen Hall Jameson is really a co-author on all this work, and we thank others. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. That was really great. If I would just want to remind the audience, if you have questions for Dan or any of the panelists, remember, just put them in the live chat. We'll accumulate them, or tweet them out by tagging at NSF_prepare. Next up is Dolores Albarracin. Dolores is a professor of psychology, business, and medicine at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And her research is an unusual combination of basic and applied psychology, focusing on attitudes, communication, and behavior. And Dolores, you're up.
You're muted still, Dolores.
I cannot unmute myself and share the screen at the same time. Okay. All right. Thanks for the invitation. And I'd like to start with just a caveat of the topic of my presentation, which is essentially some theoretical points on the impact of information and persuasive communications on behavior relevant to pandemics, which are several considerations for modeling that I produced for a recent conference organized by NSF, and you have the link here with all the plenary talks and so on. So the idea was to contribute what could be done in the future that has not been done. So I have essentially a theoretical talk more than anything else, but I think it's still gonna dovetail well with what we have heard. So I'd like to begin with what I see as an information regulation continuum, in which information entails facts, data, knowledge about a referent. Then we can have persuasion in the form of, for instance, persuasive communications, in which the information is introduced with persuasive intent. Then we have, of course, environmental structural factors, such as channel factors, introducing a default option to guide behavior, and laws and regulations, which typically entail forcing individuals or highly incentivize a behavior in a particular direction, fines, deterrence, you name it. The reason I bring these up is that I see them as really relating to behavior in different ways. Information needs to have an impact by essentially ensuring that people acquire knowledge. The persuasive message can have a more direct impact on attitudes or norms or self-efficacy or intentions without necessarily introducing a lot of information. And then we have environmental structural factors and laws, which can have a direct impact on behavior. What this means is that the more immediate to behavior the impact is, the stronger the impact is likely to be, and the lesser the probability of disruption of this chain of events, this stochastic chain of events. So for instance, information needs to go through all of these stages to finally influence behavior, and typically, the influence is a little bit weakened by time and, a lot of other interference factors. Examples of this are that, for instance, we know that literacy and numeracy are important factors in the acquisition of knowledge. And also in my own work, we've shown that not having health insurance, for instance, disrupts the impact of information at every stage. So people do not acquire knowledge about vaccines. In this case, when they do not have health insurance, they also, whatever knowledge they might have, they do not process it and use it to form attitudes in the same way. And even if they have the attitudes, they don't move through the future sequences, such as developing an intention and ultimately executing the behavior. So if you look at the impact of a persuasive message, on the other hand, this is, having a direct influence on attitudes and might have a better chance of influencing behavior. And of course, when you get to the factors on the right, you're likely to have more impact. And this is actually something that if I show you some data from a review I conducted recently for the preparation of this talk for the previous conference, is actually quite supported. So if you look at the impact of informational approaches on knowledge, attitudes, intentions, and behavior, for instance, you see huge impact of informational approaches on knowledge. If you present information, people will learn it, but does it mean it affects behavior? Not really. As you can see, these are odd ratios. There's no impact on behavior whatsoever. If now you look at persuasion, which is more to the right in my chart, you can see that at least we have these effects. They're not large by any means, but at least are something. And if you look at the impact of laws and regulations and environmental structural factors, such as in this case, channel factors, you can see then there are some effects that get to be a little bit stronger on behavior, of course, and some that vary. For instance, channel factors we've shown in my own work have a very strong impact when people are in a hurry. So if you're in a hurry, getting out of a cab and you have the 20% default tip, you're going to miss the plane. Well, you're going to go with it. But when you have time to really think, do I want to allow this default to go through, you might change this. So this is, the overall picture in which we have to think, if we are to model the impact of informational messages or persuasive communications or other factors to guide behavior, by, for instance, introducing a particular choice architecture, we have to be thinking of this temporal process and the likely lags and delusion effects in this process. So that's one point that I like to make. One other point is that even though we see that information and persuasion have weaker effects on behavior than simply forcing people to do things with the law, they, of course, have some advantages. One is agency, and agency typically leads to people internalizing what they learned, what they were persuaded of doing. And, when people actually form attitudes, this can also spread through networks. It can form norms. It has, a variety of advantages that leads me to suggesting we should not underestimate or stop modeling the impact of these approaches, but at the same time, we have to be relatively modest, I guess, or realistic in expecting impact. And, in that sense, anything that advocates information of a particular kind having a huge impact on behavior, tends to be probably, somewhat unrealistic and with some confounds in between. So the second half of my talk looks at 3 types of problems that I think need to be taken into account when we model behavior in epidemics in relation to specifically communications, right? The first one is understanding information versus change in attitudes and behavioral patterns. The second one is understanding the delayed effects of communications. And the third one is understanding the impact of multiple communications, because we're never really looking at one factor. So in respect to formation versus change, when we have no attitude or no behavioral pattern formed, and we encounter a message, we process it, we can read or pay attention to all of this and form a new attitude, tabula rasa. This is a very different process from what happens when we actually have an initial attitude. Because when we do, we simply retrieve that attitude, often automatically, and then we tend to select messages that support this attitude, very much like the type of phenomena that Dan was describing. And guess what? If we select consistent information, the more pro-attitudinal information we take in, the stronger our attitude. So the impact of information when people do not have an initial attitude is, diametrically opposed to what happens when we have an initial attitude, in part because the messages we receive, if they counter our attitudes, might actually strengthen our attitudes rather than changing them in the desired direction. So possible questions about formation and change are, first, are informational and persuasive communications more impactful earlier versus later in an epidemic? And the second one is, under what conditions is correcting misinformation worth attempting versus, for instance, highlighting new beliefs? That is because misinformation aligns very much with having a prior attitude or prior belief model. And we're really fighting a very difficult battle. It's actually, the impact of misinformation up front in our own meta-analytic work has, the odds of that succeeding are 266 to 1. The odds of correcting are something like 6 to 1. So we are probably often better off highlighting new beliefs than trying to correct the incorrect ones. So the second problem in modeling the effects of communications in epidemics is understanding the delayed effects, because not everything is happening right away. And there are some classic effects, and of 2 types at least. First, we have memory processes, and we also have attributional processes that actually account for delayed effects of the message we present today, probably to be seen a month from now or X amount of time later. So here we have the sleeper effect, which is the situation in which we first receive convincing arguments presented by a non-credible source. We discount this initially because we don't think the source is credible, but over time, there's a disassociation between the arguments in the message and who said it. And therefore, we kind of drop the discounting cue, and then we see the sleeper effect, which looks like this, relative to a baseline, which appears in white, a message that contains strong arguments presented by a non-credible communicator can become more persuasive over time. And this, in my own work, assumes to some extent that people are forming representations about the argument. So the arguments persist and are going to be retrieved more easily than the source cue, which sort of becomes part of a representation of arguments. But when you think about, let's say, political communication, it's easy to think that we are likely to often process messages trying to form a representation of the actual source, the communicator. So is this a plausible candidate would be one example. And in that case, we have proposed and found a sleeper effect for the source, in which we have a credible source presenting weak arguments. You can think of a government official who might be credible, presenting a weak argument. And over time, people forget among the weak arguments and might just resort to credibility, which might be expertise, but it could also be charisma and other factors that influence our perceptions of credibility. So that is something that we found in experimental work, these two types of sleeper effects operating, and you don't need to know a lot of details about them, but simply know that the impact of communications is complex and really needs to be looked at over time. The second factor related to delayed effects of communications is attributional processes that take place. So in the initial graphs, I showed you, this kind of model in which you have a persuasive message has an impact on attitudes, which have an impact on behavior. However, after people receive a message, they might execute a behavior. So I might be told to, stay at home and start to, leave my house for a variety of trivial activities I should not be engaging in. And that is actually likely to have an impact in combination with the message. And there are different types of effects, which are essentially post-behavioral processes that lead you to reinterpret what the message said or did for you. And there are at least two pathways. One is negative influences on attitudes. For instance, if you receive a message that tells you to abstain from drug use, let's say, and later on you use drugs, then the usage makes you sort of reconsider the message and your own attitudes. And when you got a very strong admonition to not do something and you later do it, you end up concluding that your own attitude is quite strong or quite positive towards the forbidden behavior. And you could explain this through cognitive dissonance types of processes. At the same time, they might also be positive influences on attitudes. So bias scanning or various forms of that should be experiential learning tell you that perhaps through a law you begin to execute a behavior that leads you to then develop behavioral beliefs or feelings, and that ends up having a positive influence and you internalize the behavior. So that's post-behavior change. And with respect to modeling epidemic patterns, this takes me to two questions. First one is, how do psychological processes of post-behavior change influence the stability of behavioral and epidemiological patterns? And the second one concerns the stability and the salience of trustworthy and untrustworthy communication sources, and how they might actually affect what we do with respect to health recommendations. So what kinds of, let's say, sleeper effects we might see for trustworthy and untrustworthy sources. So with that, I turn to the third problem, which is understanding the impact of multiple communications. With the point being that we are not going to be able to model the epidemic without properly acknowledging that we are really dealing with a multitude of persuasive messages, with an ecosystem of media and normative messages and so on. So that's something to take into account, and also the fact that the epidemic is related to multiple behaviors, right? And the preventive mitigation behaviors are typically a cluster of behaviors. So in work we've done, we've actually analyzed the impact of multiple behavior interventions quite a bit in 3 domains: lifestyle, HIV, and substance use. So for lifestyle, you have interventions designed to get people to quit smoking, improve their diet, and exercise more. The HIV domain typically has things such as, reduce your alcohol use and also increase your medication adherence, take your meds the right way and the right time, and so on. and substance use, which of course are typically poly recommendation treatments, in which not only should you quit doing cocaine, but also using alcohol and other things, because they are assumed to be somewhat interrelated. The reason the programs come this way, when these packages of behaviors are typically pragmatic, because the population has multiple risks, then why not combining everything? It's going to be less expensive to deliver, it's practical, and they need it. But we wanted to look a little bit at how they actually work and the likely processes. And we've done this through meta-analytic work in which we compare multiple behavior programs with single behavior programs, but we've also looked at how many behavioral recommendations should we introduce? Should we tell people to vaccinate, wear masks, and socially distance, or should we just do one of these three? Or there are specific effects of combining them. And one possible way of looking at this is that we have a behavioral system in which one behavior cues other behaviors. So behavior 1 might influence behavior 2, but it's also getting influences from behavior 3, 2, and 4 are reciprocally related in this case. And if we have this system with all activation, essentially, the more behaviors you impact, the greater the effect on each should be, which it's great because it means the more behaviors I introduce for a population, the better I will be, because the cluster or the system will be activating each of them a little bit more. So we've looked at this because, of course, you could imagine that people might be doing a cost-benefit analysis and that you might get what's referred to as risk compensation. And that would be, well, if I can get a decrease in risk through either behavior 1 or behavior 2, then if I increase behavior 1, I decrease 2. So that would suggest, well, let's not tell them about wearing masks too much if we want them to vaccinate, because if they wear the mask, they will not see a need to vaccinate, that type of approach. Turns out that there is very little empirical evidence that this happens, at least in a general way, in the literature that I've looked at. In our own work, what we've found is really consistent with this, a positive, cueing system more than with this. What we find consistently is that the more behavioral recommendations you introduce, the better the average change in each behavior. And this happens in the area of lifestyle, in the area of drug use, and also in the area of HIV. So that's another point. The need to really be considering the bundling or possible interference effects among different behaviors in the population and in the way in which we are communicating. So questions about multiple behaviors and risks. What is the structure of patterns of behaviors relevant to, let's say, COVID-19? So how are they related to each other? And what's the evolution of those patterns over time? How do changes in one behavior, as well as recommendations to change one behavior, affect others? And what's the optimal number of recommendations, as well as the optimal sequence in which they should be provided? So in summary, there's large evidence about the impact of informational and persuasive communications, but that doesn't really make them necessarily easy to model. And I would highlight at least 3 problems that we need to think about in terms of the modeling. First one is formation versus change, post-behavior and post-message processing, and finally, the processing of multiple behavioral messages and context with multiple messages. And I will end with some cross-cutting questions that I pose for the conference that we organized, but I'm very happy to be able to share this with you as well. First one is, how does the state of an epidemic influence public health recommendations and attention to them by recipients? What are the psychological responses to public health communications, and what conditions may derail communication impact? Also, to what extent are these processes spreading through networks, and what are the likely emergent phenomena that we cannot really understand from the individual level of analyses? And finally, what are the effects of communicating in the context of constantly changing reality? So, for instance, a complex pandemic in which we never fully understand the processes, and we actually need to change recommendations and so on adherence to the communication recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolores. Again, I want to remind everyone in the audience that we are accumulating questions for people that will go through at the end of the session. So if you have a question for any of our panelists, put it in the live chat or tweet them by tagging at NSF_prepare. And now for our final panelists, we have Dina Mistry. Dina is a network and data scientist at Twitter, and her research includes building data-driven models and methods for research, especially around public health, misinformation, and projects that help the social good in the real world. So over to you, Dina.
Thanks. All right, let's share my screen. All right, are you able to see my screen? Perfect. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this panel. I'm actually going to be talking about behavior in a little bit of a different way than the rest of the panelists have been talking about. So a lot of my work has been thinking about, rather than behavioral change so much as exactly who are we interacting with in our daily lives, and what that can tell us about COVID-19 control and the value of different interventions. So a bit about myself. I have my PhD and my master's degree in physics. So it might kind of confuse people as to what's a physicist doing working on COVID modeling and epidemics, but actually a lot of my work for the past couple of years has been thinking about complex contagions and networks, and really this idea of how do we characterize who we're interacting with in our daily lives, and how do we bring that kind of understanding into our infectious disease models? What does that tell us about risk profiles for different diseases, or again, the value of different kinds of interventions that we could enact? And this is a lot of what I've been doing during my postdoctoral work as well. Sort of tried to branch out into more of the behavioral awareness models, but as a result of COVID, I've sort of come back to a lot more of the mixing patterns work and trying to bring that into our epidemic models for COVID-19. So before I get further into the talk, I do want to point something out. On the work that I'll talk about today, it's either been done by myself or several of my collaborators listed here. I've been very, very fortunate to work with many people on really meaningful science, and I count myself lucky for that. Science to me is really a collaborative effort and the work of more than one. So I want to point out that everything you'll see here today is not just a result of my own work, but also those of many others. So by now, I feel like most people have heard something about infectious disease modeling, in particular, the mechanistic compartmental models that a lot of us in EPI have been using. For those who are unfamiliar, what I'm showing you here is a classic compartmental infectious disease model describing the progression of members of a population through different disease and health states. And we use them to try to predict how a disease might spread. To be able to understand what epidemic outcomes, like the total number of people infected, might look like, or when the peak of an epidemic might occur, as well as to understand the impact of some kinds of interventions to reduce transmission. So what I'll say here is that one of the things that you've probably also heard about is the basic reproduction number. That's a number that characterizes the growth rate of an epidemic. And so a lot of what I think about has been exactly what goes into how people move from being susceptible to a disease to being infected. And with COVID-19, as we've seen, there can be a lot more states of the disease than just being susceptible or infected or recovered. In fact, we see that people can become exposed to the disease, but not yet infectious. You can be infected and be symptomatic, but you might also not present with any outward symptoms and still yet infect other people. COVID-19 has also been, unfortunately, a disease that many people pass away from. So this is just a general sense of what our transmission models tend to look like for this particular disease. This does not include, anything of vaccines or variants yet, but just the general model that a lot of us have been using for the past year. And so, again, as I said, the thing that I think a lot about is just how are people exposed to infectious disease? The factor that makes people go from susceptible to some later part in disease progression. And to me, one of the best ways to think about this is to think about, well, who are you connected to? And therefore, who are you going to be exposed to in terms of if they are infected, right? With networks or with other kinds of mixing patterns, we can define who's connected to who, either as actual links or probabilities of connection to different groups. And when we use that, we can get a better sense of, how many people we expect to become infected from a disease, or who in the population we expect to become infected from a disease. So as a reminder, COVID-19 transmission, it's multimodal. We're not just talking about your direct contacts, people you touch, or people that you sit really, really close to. It's a little bit more indirect than that. COVID-19 transmission is also airborne. So you can become exposed by inhaling infectious droplets suspended in the air from someone who was nearby recently. For example, speaking, coughing, sneezing, even singing. Those are all activities that we've seen lead to transmission. So when we talk about who you're nearby or who your contacts are, who we want to be modeling in that sense, like it really is about who you share physical proximity with. And when we try to model this from my approach, a lot of what I think about is who are your most frequent contacts, your most regular contacts, the ones that we really have been collecting data on for quite a while and we can characterize fairly well. So you might imagine that this includes things like people that you live with in households, people that you go to school with if you're in school or working there, people that you might work with. We see a lot of patterns there that are distinct to each layer. Sizes are smaller in households than they are in schools or workplaces. You see really distinct age patterns amongst the people that live in households. Clearly, there are very distinct age patterns in schools. We don't just mix all together in schools, but rather it's kids that are there and adults in workplaces more often. So we really, from my perspective, when we want to be doing this kind of disease modeling and understanding exposure, we need to have some sort of information, some sort of numbers behind that to quantify what are these frequencies of interaction and just who is interacting with whom in these different settings. So one method that my colleagues and I have been working on for quite some time and just published this earlier this year is to infer the average age, the average per person age mixing patterns using a combination of census and survey data for a large number of subnational locations. I think we covered the 280 of them roughly. And so here what I'm showing you in panel A is household mixing patterns. Panel B is school mixing patterns, and panel C is mixing patterns in the workplace. Now, each matrix is showing you essentially the average per capita frequency of interaction for a person on the x-axis, their age being indicated on the x-axis, and then the age of their contacts on the y-axis. The color is indicating for us here the frequency of contact. And so what we see is that each setting has some pretty distinct patterns to it. You know, in households, you are, and I think that a lot of us understand this inherently to some extent, in households, you are a lot more likely to see interaction between couples of similar ages living together, or parents and their children interacting. In schools, you mostly see a lot of high frequency contact between children, because that's mostly who's going to school. And in workplaces, we don't really see kids as much. We see the adult, the working population. The really interesting thing about this kind of work is that what we see is that while the patterns are shared across the set, across locations, there are still, you know, distinctions between different locations. So if you can see, there are a couple of different locations within each panel. We're showing the national patterns, for example, for China, United States, and India, and then a couple of subnational locations. And what you can, for the households, and what you can see is that, you know, while they all kind of look similar, there are some distinctions, right? What we found is that in China, because of the one-child policy up until recently, you know, you don't really have a lot of mixing between little kids in households, because in general, they don't have siblings. Whereas in India, you see a splitting of couples as they get older, because it used to be very, very common to have more than, you know, 5-10 years age gap between married couples. So you actually see these kinds of things showing up in the matrices, and that has an impact on, you know, what that means for our disease models later on. There are other approaches to doing this kind of work. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a number of other approaches to collect this kind of data. And even previous to that, you know, you can use surveys, quantitative surveys, and then do work to project them forward to the full population. There have been studies that use wearable sensors. So asking people to wear a sensor in their community, get a whole bunch of other people to do the same, and then to collect that data and figure out, you know, the frequency of contact that they have with other individuals in their community of different ages, maybe finding out more about their relationships to each other as well. We also see a lot of this through app data. So recently there's been a lot of interest for groups, for companies like Facebook, to actually tell us information about, you know, like who is interacting with whom where. It's a little bit of trouble there in that they can't really share all of that data with us researchers, but it is an interesting source to look at, because, you know, something as researchers is that we can't afford to do all of these studies everywhere in the world, but companies like Facebook have a lot more of that data on at their hands. What I'll note here is that all of this work was pre-pandemic for the most part. You know, the results I'm showing you here are during sort of quote unquote normal times. But there is still a need to look at what that means for, you know, during COVID-19, because things have changed a whole lot. And I'll get to that in a later slide. So I just want to point out that, you know, what we can do with those patterns is that we can integrate them into our epidemic models. We can put them in as factors into how people move between different states. And the thing that I'm showing you here is that, you know, if you keep everything about the disease itself the same, but you change the age mixing patterns and you specify the actual age demographics of each population, we can still see really different results just by including that. So it's the same disease. The figure on the right is showing you the exact same disease for all populations, but using each location's age mixing patterns and the actual age distribution. And what we see is that, you know, we get estimates that are lower than the homogeneous mixing model assumption, But we also get really widely different estimates for things like the early growth rate and the overall attack rate. And this is important because I think it just shows you how if we incorporate more data, even if it's not perfect, but if it's getting us closer to a more realistic picture of what people are doing, then we can have more informative estimates about the impact of a disease on different populations. So, as I mentioned before, the work that I was showing before was pre-pandemic related research, but ongoing outbreaks have pretty much changed everything for us. Since early 2020, public health pretty much everywhere around the world has been sending the message to people: stay at home, keep schools closed, work from home if possible, if you're not an essential worker, socially distance. And that means that our mixing patterns have changed a lot. So this isn't my work, but it's some work of my colleagues. And what they're doing here is they compared survey results of people reporting who their contacts were prior to the pandemic to then results to a survey that they conducted during the early days of lockdown in China. So this is showing results for Wuhan and Shanghai. And it really just goes to show you that, we changed a lot in terms of our behavior of who we are interacting with by asking people to stay at home. Those other mixing patterns that I was showing before need to change altogether. We need to be able to disaggregate them down to different social settings and be able to change up the weights, because we have asked people to fundamentally do something different, reduce their risk of exposure to disease. And if we want to be able to understand, the impact of doing that, we need to both collect the data on that and measure what those changes are compared to the baseline before. Otherwise, we won't really understand, is it that people stayed at home and this is what's been effective at reducing transmission, or is it some other thing that's been going on? In addition to, changing exactly who we're in contact with, just in general, we've seen a lot of shift in contact patterns from the lockdown measures. So I can speak from the US context that in the US, we've seen a lot less time spent in commercial and economic spaces, a lot more time spent at home. So here, what I'm showing you is just some results from Google mobility trends. And what they've done is they've allowed people to get data on their own community to see the relative changes in mobility or people showing up in different locations over time. So here they're showing there's been an increase in people going to parks during the pandemic, as opposed to a decrease in people going to commercial spaces during that time. We also see an increase in people going out, people staying at home. So this helps us get, when we collect this kind of data, when we have this kind of data, it allows us to get a better sense of, those social mixing patterns I was showing before. How do we weight them differently as the pandemic continues, as we ask people to do these different things of socially distancing and trying to protect themselves by staying home? So the data that I was showing before is really useful in compartmental models, but we don't just want to, reduce transmission overall. We've been trying to do things in terms of interventions to get at a more finer grained detail of how to protect people. So one of the things has been, and I feel like a lot of people have heard of this, can we identify who's been exposed and trace their contacts, right? This is contact tracing. And that means that we need to know just who you're in contact with, like the actual individuals, not just an overall average, mixing pattern. And this means that our compartmental models are no longer really the appropriate choice of model framework, because we're not really tracking individuals in that case. We just have, a likelihood of contact with some other age group. So now we need more detailed models to go beyond this. And in fact, we need agent-based models with contact networks. And so what I've been working on is using things like those age mixing patterns, the number of contacts we have in different social settings, household sizes, schools, workplaces, the actual activity rates of people in those different settings, to try and work backwards and create representative networks of who we're in touch with so that we can bring them into our models. And so that brings me to the actual models that I've been working on. So on one hand, it's been an interesting experience. So the work that my colleagues and I have been doing has been sort of a dual modeling approach. On the one hand, we have a model called SynthPops to handle the actual network structure, for a given population around the world. Let's not tie this to any specific data source, but whatever data we can find on what their households look like, what their schools look like, what their workplaces look like, what they might be doing in their communities. Can we model that in terms of not only the number of contacts, but also the age patterns and other kinds of demographics? On the other hand, building an agent-based model of disease progression, disease transmission, and this model, COVASIM, has the ability to include, to actually build upon those networks, right? So it takes in those contact networks as a sense of who might be exposed to who at different times in different settings, and then uses that to look at who might be transmitting the disease to each other. So we used these two models and applied them to look at what was happening in Seattle, King County, because that's where we're actually based out of. And the idea here was to understand, we had a lot of infections going on by end of summer last year. It was growing quite a lot. And we wanted to understand, what's the value of different interventions to help drive down transmission in an agent-based modeling framework, right? We want to know specifically, if we tell certain individuals that you have been contact traced, stay home. How many people do we need to do this? What's the rate of conversion that we need to really drive down transmission to keep it low? And so on the right-hand side here, you're just seeing like a sort of a snapshot of what the networks might look like. So we have a lot of different group sizings for different settings. This is all data informed. And then we have different age mixing patterns within that to reflect who's showing up in different settings. And so with these networks, we were able to assess different intervention strategies in Seattle and the different aspects of each kind of strategy. So in particular, we were focusing on strategies that implemented contact tracing, diagnostic testing, and then asking people to quarantine or self-isolate. And the central finding of our study was that, although these interventions can control COVID, it's really hard to do so unless we get very high numbers of people engaging in those activities, right? So I'll show you another slide. But really what we found is that by the end of 2020, summer 2020 in Seattle, we could have reopened to having people really going back, the full mobility scale, having people going back to work and having as many of their contacts as prior. But it only really works if we have a very high level of diagnostic testing, contact tracing, quarantining, and other MPIs like mask wearing, which is a really hard ask for a lot of people to do. And so this is just to show, both to the general public and I think to public health, that it takes a lot of work to keep transmission low for a disease like COVID, and that our behavior matters a lot. Like just going back to business as normal was not going to be an easy task for us to do. I think I'll wrap up now, so I don't think we have a whole lot of time left, but I kind of want to leave you with the message that, I think COVID-19 pandemics like this in general have just shown us that the data collection on these different contact networks, on who's mixing with who, on the demographics of who's exposed to who, is really important to include because it changes our estimates of disease transmission a lot. There also needs to be much more nuanced modeling in aspects of things like socioeconomic conditions of contact and exposure. The work that I was doing, that my colleagues and I did, it looks at overall patterns for a population, but it doesn't look yet at the risk of exposure for different groups. You know, in Seattle, for example, we know for a fact that certain communities were hit harder because there are more essential workers there, because they are going to be more likely to be exposed because we're asking them to do riskier things, go to work. Yes, we know that there's still, a pandemic going on, but you have to go to work. And so for our models to really do justice by them, we need to be able to bring in that nuance, model them better, have a better understanding of what is putting them at risk. In addition to this, clearly, I think now a lot of models are doing this, but when we were doing this back in 2020, we weren't including the effects of vaccinations or therapeutics or variants because we hadn't seen that yet. But clearly the pandemic has shown us that we actually need that because this is what's going to happen. And finally, there's still a lot of work left to do on better handling of geography, of mobility between different countries or different states, and the role of importations, because even when we get to a state at which a location might be pandemic free, there's always the possibility of an importation resparking something, and we need to understand what we need to do in order to prevent that from creating an outbreak. And with that, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dina. We have, looks like about 15 minutes remaining, and we have a lot of questions here. Let me start by going for primacy and recency. So let me ask Dina and Christian of the following question. From Dina, is there any modeling or representation of psychology within your agents and in your agent-based simulations, especially in the data that you're showing? And then for Christian, is there a way for taking the agents that you're developing and embed them within some kind of agent-based modeling approach, such as the one that we just saw from Dina? So let's go with Dina first.
So what I'll say is that no, we haven't gotten to that stage yet, but that is absolutely the kind of thing that I think needs to also happen. Some of the work that I've been doing a little bit with COVID has been looking at bringing in more of that psychology. I understand how people make decisions about what to do in the face of an outbreak, depending on what they understand of disease risk. But again, that requires a lot more information on psychology, on social trust, on understanding what influences people to make their decisions. And bringing that into an agent-based model also means that I feel like we need a lot more data on what different kinds of people might be doing. It's not right to say that an adult male might be doing something in a particular way and that applies equally well to a young woman, right? So I think that those kinds of things, when we have that kind of data, will be really informative for the agent-based transmission models.
Very good, thanks. Christian?
Yeah, so we're obviously, as I mentioned, working on that now. So our framework is actually quite flexible in terms of what input it would get from the AP model in terms of both, for example, of information flows. And those can be individualized. So it doesn't have to be the case that the model is a normative model and we just replicate it 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times and it's all the same individual. As I mentioned, we can parameterize the knowledge constructs, in particular in the model, can be parameterized to reflect different biases, different information diets and so forth, and therefore behave in different ways. And again, on the output, of course, the action affordances defined by the simulation can be, as I mentioned, we've modeled distancing, we model mask wearing, we're going to model vaccination, so we can model a number of behaviors. So I think we have a lot of flexibility in how to integrate that. And the last thing I'll mention is Dina mentioned at the start, essentially, that parameters in the ordinary differential equation that could sort of like be modified to reflect those mixing factors. And that's also something we're looking at, as I mentioned, how to express a cognitive model in those terms that obviously would both make it more analytically tractable as well as be sort of a more standard form factor within the epidemiological community.
Very good, thank you. So let me now go to Dolores and Dan. And this was a question posed to Dolores, but I'm going to also ask it of Dan. And it's about educational interventions. And so there's a great deal of interest, at least within psychology, about the idea of having some form of intervention, some form of education that might make people less susceptible to misinformation or conspiracy theories. Is there anything that you see on the horizon that would help with this situation?
Yeah, improving education in general, so improving critical thinking and the ability to critically evaluate information and check sources to determine whether those sources are reputable, appropriate, and that kind of thing. Besides that, there are some sort of focused programs that say, well, pay attention to accuracy and things like that, accuracy primes. But for the most part, the battle between misinformation and correction is lost from the start. So the best approach is to prevent misinformation if at all possible, and really to try to instill a sense of critical thinking, which seems to be, at least in my own work, what works best. We have a recent paper showing that even though trust in science is sort of touted as a possible solution, it's actually not when it comes to the kind of pseudoscience that we've seen during the pandemic and the kind of pseudoscience that normally exists, right? So people in the anti-vaccination movement are not using non-scientific concepts. They have the trappings of science, they have some ideas. So the more you increase trust in science without some basic understanding of the methods of science or the ability to discriminate good from bad sources, the worse the trap is. So people who have trust in science are often the ones who go for those types of movements. So yeah, I don't know if that makes me skeptical or optimistic. But.
Dan?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll give you the pessimistic side first, which is I've looked at what a lot of people are trying to do in regard to conspiracy theories, and I don't think aside from what we find, like that, people who follow print news, became less likely to believe in these conspiracies, so that's good news. But the hardcore folks who are predisposed to believe in them are a big challenge. And given that they think that most elites are not trustworthy and that they can't be believed, it's very difficult to give them information that they'll accept unless it comes from someone within their inner circle. So for example, if Donald Trump suddenly said it's a good idea to wear a mask and actually did it, and told people that it was a good idea to vaccinate, you might see some movement among those conspiracy believers who currently don't want to adopt those behaviors. I think that would be one potential solution, but of course, very difficult to see that happening. The other side of it is if you just want to get behavior to change, try to make it as normative as possible. So if you want vaccination to become more acceptable, we should be doing more to make vaccination a normative behavior, which can happen, I think, by encouraging people to take the flu vaccine, to take all the other vaccines that are available to them through the medical profession and other sources, encouraging people to do things that are, in general, good for stopping the progression of diseases. And forget about the conspiracies, just have people focus on the things that you might be able to disassociate from all of these factors that inhibit people from doing the things we need to do.
Yeah, thanks. I was struck by something, a conversation some friends and I were having about travel. And I remember during my parents' time, at least, vaccination and tests were kind of a common thing. If you were going to a foreign country, even Europe, there was a set of vaccines you would just have to get, and you just couldn't travel if you didn't. And that seems to have slipped away. And now that is such a big deal to ask someone to have a vaccine card to go someplace. And so that norm has just drifted away, and one could imagine recreating it. So let me ask a question again for Dolores and Dan, and then I'll go around to the others. And this has to do with the issue of trust and credibility. And I don't think it's actually in any of the questions here, but it comes up over and over again that those are two key things. So what can be done by sources of information to become more credible and more trustworthy? Dan.
Well, I think one of the things we've seen with regard to the pandemic is the communicators, the professional communicators haven't done a great job, both in terms of the media and the science end. CDC, tells people what they should do. Unfortunately, they don't always tell people why they're telling people what to do. And the news media doesn't do a good job of explaining why it is that CDC is asking us to do certain things. So for example, in March, when they said, don't wear a mask, they should have explained what they meant by that, because clearly some people were wearing them and should wear them. And what they should have done a better job of is saying, we now know a month or two later that this disease is spread through the air, and we weren't sure of that before. Now we know it. You guys should be wearing a mask. And by not giving people all that information, both by the news media and by CDC, I think it makes people skeptical. They think, oh, why did they tell us one thing at one point in time and another thing at another point? And that falls right into the hands of the conspiracy believers who say, you can't trust these folks because they tell you one thing one day and another thing another day, and who knows whether it's really based on anything legitimate. So that's my rant.
Sure. Okay. Dolores?
Yeah, briefly, I would say that, just like correcting misinformation, increasing trust in CDC is not necessarily an end in and of itself. So do we need it? If we need it, then we must do it, but we don't necessarily need it. It's probably easier to get people to trust their minister and go get vaccinated in church than it is to change their opinions about the federal government, right? That might take, 18 years of schooling and who knows what, brain transplant in some cases. So I think, in a lot of the cases, it's probably better to go for trusted sources rather than trying to change the trust in distrusted ones.
And so let me go back to Dina and Christian. You guys are modeling things at slightly different levels, but there are many aspects of the environment that are driving behavior, whether it's mixing or the choice of what to wear a mask or whatever. And this could include everything from the weather to perception, I guess, as Christian was talking about, perceptions of the case rates that are around you. What do you think are kind of the most important factors, kind of the strongest factors to include out of those environmental contexts that change on a fairly dynamic basis, meaning day to day, week to week. Dina?
Really know, because there's so many of them, and it's really hard at this point to tease out just what one factor might have, like the value of one factor versus another. I think probably from the results that we've seen of just the actual mask wearing, that those kinds of behaviors are sort of the most impactful. I also think that there's a lot of value in people doing things like actually being willing to go out and get vaccinated. That's probably, that's the reason why certain counties throughout the U.S. are not seeing rises in the Delta variant, the Delta variant, as opposed to other locations. I think that going on further, we're going to see that the willingness to get vaccinated, the willingness to mask up, is really what's going to distinguish different places throughout the U.S. in terms of their number of cases.
Okay. Christian, I'll let you wrap up here with the same question with one nuance, because I know you have an opinion on this. Do you think these environmental contextual factors are more dominant than the actual announcements of mandates and things like that, the non-pharmaceutical interventions that get announced by the city and the region and the states? So this is an opinion, I guess.
No, I think so, and that partly reflects just the information environment in which we are living, where I think Dan mentioned that people pay much more attention these days to social media than they do to the official sources. Very few people read newspapers or watch network news. But there was a recent paper in PNAS that showed that the changes in behavior, like mobility, for example, largely took place before the mandates were officially instituted. So people are very quick at adapting when they sense and they understand that something critical is at play. So I do think the messaging part and how to frame the messaging in a way that is credible is probably as important as mandates, if not even more important.
Okay, very good. So I think we're at the end of our time here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Please share all these links, including the YouTube channel, with all your colleagues and friends. And do I turn it back to Anil or Aaron?
Yeah, I think Anil will pick it up. Go ahead, Anil.
Well, I'd like to thank all the speakers and Pete for this wonderful discussion, and thanks to all the audience for joining us today. And like Pete said, please share the links, and for the speakers, there'll be more engagement over the YouTube channel. And to everyone, stay safe and stay prepared.